Okay.
Yourself, I don't want to butcher it too much. And Steinbeisser.
Beiser.
Yeah. Steinbeisser.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Thank you again for coming. Appreciate it. Where is he? Camby, where'd you go? Camby Reynolds. So if you have a commercial pesticide license, Camby went through the effort to contact the state to get approval for CEU credits for your commercial licenses. And he put the sign-up sheet over there. And so if you have a license, you don't even have to have the number with you today. Just go sign your name up on that. Camby will submit that, and you'll get CEU credits onto your commercial license. So really appreciate that. Again, really appreciate everybody being willing to come here. I apologize when you get 48 hours notice that a speaker's not coming. It's really hard to fill that slot. Totally acceptable. I totally understand why Bart didn't come. And actually, like I said, he was trying to come here today, this morning. I talked to him and I said, no, just take care of your family. We'll deal with it later. We'll catch your presentations later. He was excited about that. He wants to be here. If any of you have known Dr. Bart Stevens, he's a fabulous guy, a lot of information. So we'll catch up with him at a later date. So our agenda, we're pretty relaxed today. We're not as tight on the schedule. But our main show and the show now, unfortunately, is all on Don's shoulders, but we really appreciate him. Don comes out of Sydney, Montana. He's a producer up there. He has switched from furrow irrigation to pivots, and so that's why we really wanted to bring him in and bring you the perspective from a producer. And we got two presentations for you today. We're going to talk about kind of pitfalls with center pivots, and then we're going to bring in and switch topics and go into soil moisture sensors and kind of just give you more of a producer perspective, because we have industry in the area that can help you on that technical side and all that. But a producer that can say, you need to ask this question to your service rep, right? So that's what we're going to do today. We're still going to serve you some lunch and send you home with a full belly and all that. So really appreciate it. I think Don would appreciate it if you chimed in. Bring your questions, bring your comments, your perspective. Let's make this a dialogue back and forth so we can help everybody just understand it more. But again, really appreciate you all being here. If there's anything I can ever do for you, or Extension or the university, really would appreciate that. We'll eat lunch. And then after lunch, we'll just kind of open it up just as a loose, open discussion. I don't have a main topic, but just want to hear feedback from you since we have some time. And what I'm hoping for this event is I'm hoping to do this annually for you. And so coordination with a lot of people. Gary White helped put this on. Appreciate Gary's support and input. Dave Doherty with Molson Coors helped. And then UW colleagues. Really appreciate everybody's help, because I can't do this alone. I'll tell you what, these are a monster to put on. And the worst thing in the world is to bring you a good speaker. And I'm there with you. There's nothing worse than hearing somebody that's not a good presenter or speaker, or a topic that's not relevant, right? But I think we did that today. And I'm really excited to turn it over to Don. Thank you so much for being here. Don Steinbeisser, right? Yep. I didn't butcher that one. Okay, but anyway, thank you so much, everyone. We'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. As far as being a good speaker, well, we're going to find out about that. This is the first one of these kind of things I've done. Everybody that knows me knows that I don't shut up. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and speak up. And do those points transfer to Montana? Okay. I'm a sugar beet farmer, rancher from eastern Montana, and I just found out we get about twice the rainfall you guys do, but it's still a big whopping 12 inches. So I don't have it quite as dry as you guys do. This year I did. So I've learned a little extra things about pivots that I didn't know before. So,
Don, before you get rolling, can everybody hear, or do we need to switch to a microphone and speaker?
Microphone?
Oh, okay. We'll do it. We're going to switch.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll just try and set it off here
Okay.
to your right.
Okay.
And hopefully we don't get feedback.
Hello? Not up. Or not on. There you go. Hello? Nope. This is on. Oh, there you go. Now can you hear me? That's better. Okay. I'm Don Steinbeisser from Sydney, Montana. I'm a third generation sugar beet farmer, rancher. All the feed that goes along with keeping our cows and feedlot full. So, and about 1998, we started switching over to pivot irrigation because we just could not find enough labor. We had 1,200 acres of sugar beets, and even though I was a lot younger then, I still couldn't keep up with it all. And we had 6 or 8 guys helping us water, and we couldn't keep decent help. So we decided that even though we thought they were too expensive then, that we'd start switching over. So we took the fields that were our worst ones with 3 and 4 cross ditches and center drains and just a lot of work to irrigate. And the first pivot we put up got rid of 11 turnouts, but it was 305 acres. More acres, the cheaper the pivot, but we had to cross a drain ditch and a lateral twice. So we built bridges out of drill stem and sucker rod and made what we thought was good enough dirt ramps to go over the irrigation laterals, and started using it. The next spring, the Belmont engineers came out to look at it and said, well, that'll never work. But it already had for a year. And we did it that way for 10 more years before we put up enough pivots so we could close the lateral and farm over it without having to cross bridges. Now, it did take life out of our pivot. We broke a lot of bolts and a lot of connecting socks and things like that, but it still was a lot less work than moving irrigation tubes. The first couple years, our sugar beet yields underneath our pivots, they were okay. This was pre-Roundup, by the way. So, but they weren't as good as our flood irrigation. So I started talking to both the ARS station in Sydney, the guy before Bart was there, and our Belmont dealer, Barley dealer in Sydney. And we did a lot of different things, and the state experiment station to put up a linear. So I started talking to those guys, and they actually didn't know a whole lot more than I did because they had never done it either. So we started messing around with different things about, instead of applying a 1/2 inch at a time, I started, irrigating up, putting on small amounts of water needed, just not to create such a thick crust and cause other problems. And that did work, but later on in the season, we started going up to 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches. And as everybody knows with the pivot, especially in nice, hot, warm Wyoming, Montana weather with the wind, you get about 80% efficiency until your corn gets growed up over your nozzles, then that gets better. But we've got to see, you have to remember those kind of things when you're putting on water with beets, that only 80% of that water is usually getting on the ground, except for at night, it goes up. So you can cause other problems, which we'll talk about later too. Our second pivot we put up was another big one, and we had really serious trouble with pivot tracks. So about halfway through the season, our Belmont dealer, Valley dealer, said, let's try some of this PAM product. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it or used it. Well, if one of your pivot dealers comes up to you, hang a bag of that on the tower, shoot him. we had pivot tracks already 1.5 2 foot deep. We put that on there, and I was under 40 and still stupid. We got it stuck in the middle of the cornfield when we're running it dry. We still got it stuck in the middle of the cornfield after it had been off for a week and a half. And I didn't want to take a tractor and run over my nice, beautiful corn I was going to chop. So me and 11 guys put a rope on it. We pulled it out of the field. I will never, ever, ever do that again. I had 3 or 4 hired men that were ready to kill me. I did buy beer that night, but it was just, you know, I wasn't even that young. I was just stupid. I just thought that was the way to do it, not to wreck my corn. But next time it's a tractor, which it has been. So you get to learn the hard way on some things, but it still was I'm still learning every day. Every year, everything's different. Different crops are different. Rains come different. You know, the one year in May, we got 15 inches of rain. So just trying to move the pivot out of the way to spray the crops, it would get stuck. You know, just as well as I do, I'll probably never see 15 inches of rain in 1 month of my life again, which I hope I don't. But so no matter what you do with them, and I don't care what brand it is, they all have positives, they all have negatives. I've ran Zinkies, T&Ls, Rinkies, Barleys, all of them. We used to raise potatoes and rent ground all over eastern Montana, and I have what I mean, I have preferences because I'm used to using one more than the other, but they all did a good job. So we went with different tires and different tracks, trying to stop pivots from getting stuck and causing deep tracks in the field. And the ones that seemed to work the best for our place was egg tracks, or a system like that, just a steel track that goes over the outside of the wheel. The problem with that is, it wears your wheels out. The tracks wear out because they're steel tracks. And when you pop a tire with an egg track on there, or the plastic model of it, or whichever brand you use, you can't see it. So you completely wreck the tire or in the rim when you finally realize that the pivot's not moving anymore, especially in a cornfield. So you get to learn with that, but they still stops the pivot from getting stuck, which is a lot worse than a flat tire. We've done anything from packing out blocks and jacks. Now my go-to deal is hopefully the neighbor's track hose there, because I drive right out in the middle of the cornfield, pick up the pivot, put the new tire on it, and drive right back out. And at the end, there's a lot less damage to the corn because I'm not near as bad a mood when I leave the field as I am when I got to pack in blocks. And I'm 60 years old, I don't pack in blocks anymore. We also take the payloader out there if we can't find anything else. But you'll in a sugar beet field, we've taken a tractor, set it for beet rows, take the 3-point hitch, go out there, pick up the pivot, turn sideways, pick up the pivot, change the tire, loaded it up, and on the 4-wheeler and taking it out. And 2 weeks later, you can already tell where you're at. Potatoes are the same way. I don't know if there's any raised around here, but I drove all over those fields with tractors and pickups, and a week later, you can't see where you're at. So you're not doing as much damage as you think, and you're in a lot better mood, and you're home a lot earlier if you figure out the new ways of doing it. You guys have a lot of moss trouble in your open ditches? Okay, that I would like to know how you guys fix, because we don't usually have that until late summer when they start dumping the Bighorn Dam. But this year we started it in June because the river water was so clear and so warm that, and I've never dealt with that stuff like it is. Like, it plugged my intakes on my linear, and I've never had that. So I will be listening for you guys to tell me how you solve that problem. With sugar beets and barley and wheat under pivot, the timing of the water, if you're putting on, if you have a lot of rougher ground and the hills, little hills that the water runs off of, so you're only putting on 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch at a time. With sugar beets, you're going to cause yourself a different problem, and that's Cercospora. Even for flood irrigation, if you just have a little bit of Cercospora, if you irrigate your beets like that with a pivot, you're going to have a lot of Cercospora, because it comes around every 30 hours or whatever it takes that pivot to come around, and the leaves stay wet, and it's perfect habitat for for Secosper to come up. There'd be a problem. And I don't know if you guys are gonna have it because you have a drier climate even more than we do, so you might not have as much trouble as we had with it. But we went to putting on 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches at a time, so it was 70 hours for that pivot to come around. And didn't get rid of our problem, but made it a lot easier. And same thing with irrigating up. If you have any seedling diseases, which you guys, if you irrigate up all the time, probably know more about than I do. But if you put on too much of that, you can cause that to be worse too. And I don't know why pivot is so much different that way than flood is, but maybe because of the flood, but you know, you got to soak the furrow up good to get the beets to come up too. So what the difference is, maybe the packing of the ground when the pivot comes out or what, but we had a little bit of trouble with that. Nowadays with the seed coatings and stuff, we don't seem to have much trouble anymore. So not getting enough on. You guys do a lot of spring work, or is it mostly fall field work? None? Fall? Both. Okay. Well, the first year we put up our pivot, I plowed under corn stalks in the spring. I thought, well, this will be easy. I'll just turn the pivot on, be like a rain. Well, I planted into it, which I've never done spring work before that. We've always done it in the fall. And I started planting beets in there, and some of the beet seeds, I swear, got down to 9 inches from the lumps that were out there. They kind of bounced around and got down in the ground. So I learned really fast on that. You can't put on 35 or 40 hundreds to get the beets come up when they're like that. You got to put on 1 inch or put on 3/4 inch 3 times or whatever to get that ground to soak up. Because what happens, and I don't know why I couldn't figure this out myself the first year, is you get moisture down to a foot, but when you know, so you're out there, you see your beets coming, but it's dry down below that, what you don't get when you flood irrigate, and it dries out fast. I mean, you leave that field for 3 days, you come back and you got beets that are dying. So that took a little while to get used to, and I try to stay away from spring on heavy ground spring work for that reason. But if it's, and it wasn't, my ground wasn't dry either, that made it, you know, lumpy and hard to deal with. So just things you wouldn't think of that seem to cause you trouble because you're only putting on 1 inch instead of well, the ARS station in Sydney did a research about 20 years ago in one of our fields, seeing how much water we were putting on with flood irrigation versus pivots. And on the same field side by side, they measured the water irrigating sugar beets up at 14 inches per acre we were putting on. And we put on 1.5 inches with the beets, with the sprinkler irrigated beets, because there was good submoisture. But for that water to get from one end of the field to the other under flood irrigation was 14 inches of water. So pivots are going to save you a lot of water that way, as long as you don't try to make them save you too much water. Years like last year, we pretty much had them on 24/7 every day. I mean, we stopped on some hay pivots, you know, enough for it to dry out, enough to hay it, and occasionally stopped the beet pivot to spray it. But other than that, the beet and corn pivots were running all the time. So it wasn't a cheap year, but our power bill was about $35 to $37 an acre on our co-op power, cheaper on MDU power. But so it's not free, but it's still a lot faster and better than furrow. And half of our farm is still furrow irrigation too. We still have a lot of 10 and 20 acre fields and drain ditches and highways and county roads and telephone poles that we haven't figured out how to go around yet. So once we figure that out, we'll do something different. I do have a copy, and I only have one copy, but I'm sure that you guys have that here as well, of how much water needs to be applied for a crop. And this is actually for the Powell area, in Riverton, I guess. A year for the crop, like alfalfa, 32 inches. Well, 1 inch at a time, that's a lot of revolutions of the pivot. Sugar beets, 25 inches. So you start thinking about that. That's a lot of time that machine's got to run. And with pivot irrigation, when you go out there, and you'll see that I carry one of these because I used to walk potato fields and shovels get too heavy. This works really good. You can go out there, And please get one with the step on it, because if it's rocky ground, you're not going to get it in if it doesn't have one. But it's a lot faster way to check for soil moisture. And a shovel, you dig down, 5-6 inches with each shovelful. With this here, one push, you're done, and you can get a nice view of what's on the first 16 inches of your soil. And with the pivot, it works the opposite way of flood irrigation. It dries. I don't know how I did that, but it dries from the bottom up instead of the top down. So you'll walk out on your pivot field and there'll be mud sticking to your feet. I can go to the 4th of July picnic. I don't have to water today. Well, you stick the soil probe in the ground, and 3 inches later, it's dry. And because you're applying all that water from the top, and there's more water on top, it stays wetter on top than it does on the bottom. So, and if you let it, at least on sugar beets and corn, you can't get behind. If you get behind, you're behind. I had 6 pivots on beets this year, and I had one of them that I had water on just as much as the rest of them. I never got water down to 28 inches. It was lighter soil, so it was, and we had no rain, and we had a lot of 100-degree temperatures and a lot of 50-mile-an-hour winds, and I just never got water down to 28 inches until we got a little bit of rain this fall. Then the soil probe showed me I had some moisture down there, but and there's nothing I could do about it because the water didn't come in the irrigation ditch until 15th of May, which was already a late start. So get behind. When you buy your pivots, if you get them nozzled just a little bit bigger than what the cheapest pump and pipe will get you, it can pay for itself. Now, if you're getting a government cost share on it, good luck, because they'll do it, and it'll be the minimum amount of water you can apply on at least Montana. Okay, Wyoming might be smarter than we are. The minimum amount of water you can apply, because then you get smaller pumps, use less water, but you don't use less water. The pivot just runs longer. So you're using the same amount of water, more power, and more time. As soon as ours came off of government, we had a linear put up in a quarter circle or half circle, which were too expensive. We waited till we got equip money. And the minute that thing come off of equip, I went out and changed the nozzles and got it to put enough water on to make it way easier to manage. My pump was big enough to do that with because it was small enough acreage. But that's something to think about when you're doing it. Is I know it adds a little bit of cost to it, but just the next step up on the, just a little bump up on the amount of water you can put on per revolution can really make life a lot easier on a dry year, which sounds like you guys have all the time with 6 inches of rain. You guys must never have any submoisture in the ground without irrigation. So I just found out that works a lot better. And our local sale guy we've been dealing with, he came off an irrigated farm and kind of realized that. And if it's not under a well, when it's under a well, you don't have a lot of choice because you just take what the well will give you. But with canal water or river water in your own pump or whatever, it's a lot better. You guys, most of your water comes out of canals. Same thing I deal with, which is, I mean, you only got to boost the water, so you don't have to pump it from 200 feet down or nothing like that. So it's a lot cheaper that way, but you got to pay the water taxes and the maintenance and the ditches and all that stuff. So it's about a wash as far as cost, but, and well water doesn't treat your crops as well as river water does. Too much salt's too cold. When it's 100 degrees outside, you dump 40-degree water on a crop. It doesn't like it any more than you do when you're out there cleaning nozzles when that water's 40 degrees. Even when it's 100 degrees out, your hands still get cold. So we also take our pivots thinking it's plug nozzles. And since we're irrigating out of a ditch, we get a lot of silt. So we take the end plates off in the spring and blow water out of them. And the first 3, 4, 5 minutes will just be straight mud. I mean, liquid mud, but it's mud because just silt sits in there and builds up all year. If you don't do that, you get to clean it out of individual nozzles throughout the whole year. So it's a lot easier to blow it out the end. A little harder to get the end off than it is a nozzle, but I have younger cousins and stuff that work with me that can do that kind of thing. Yep. Yeah, I knew somebody was gonna ask that.
Don, can you repeat the question?
Yes.
so people online
Okay.
can hear you?
The question was, what type of nozzle do I like? For well water, we use spinners. And they worked fine. They were little, but they were so small, it's hard to clean. Personally, and my local dealer knows that if he ever comes out with IWOBs again, that I'll just change dealers, because I had 3 pivots of those on, and you get them in corn and they're gone. You'll lose 4 or 5 every time you go around. If you don't have corn, then they work fine. And they work better on well water than river water, or our silty river water in Yellowstone River, because the silt wears out the wobble part and it just doesn't wobble anymore. They lasted 3 or 4 years. So, I cannot remember the name of the Nelson. We have Nelson pivot nozzles. I can't remember the name of them, which is not abnormal for me because my memory is not that good. I can pick them out in the picture, but I can't remember the name of them. Maybe the Valley guys back there would know. But whatever we switch to, which I will find out for you, work really well in river water conditions. Now, if you got grass blowing in your ditch because they mowed it, the day before the wind went 50 miles an hour, or the day before you decided to start irrigating up, that's when they come mow our ditches. Leave everybody else's alone, just mow mine when it's most inconvenient for me. Then you have trouble. And corn stalks and corn leaves from the year before, we built screens over every one of our intakes because I was sick and tired of taking pumps apart and cleaning out corn cobs. And how they got in there, I have no idea, but they were. So, and the end gun pumps will plug up with corn stalks too. And they plug up solid. So. And since you're speaking of nozzles, under river water, our nozzles wear out probably faster than really good well water would wear them out. So when you're combining or chopping corn, a little harder digging beets because the beets are topped, or climb the center of your pivot and look out, or do like I do, I use a drone. You can fly over the fields and you'll see the waves. And you don't realize what yield loss you're losing with the nozzle. Yeah, it might cost you $3,000 or $3,500 to replace those nozzles that'll last 5 to 10 years, depending on your water and how much you're irrigating. But it pays. In 1 year, you'll get that money back and then some. I mean, on malt barley, we couldn't believe the difference. A cousin of mine came up and flew me over the fields, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. It looked weird. And it was luckily the field I noticed was an all heavy ground field, so it wasn't sandy spots and gravelly spots. It was nozzles. And why one nozzle out of every 10 was doing so terrible, I don't know. But we changed all the nozzles, and the next year the problem was gone. So that's something to pay attention to. You don't want to, of course, do it more often than you need to, but also think about it. Of course, the new hoses are better. If you got the old black drop hoses on your pivot, when you change the nozzles, change the hoses. They get like galvanized steel. They just get brittle, and they'll start snapping as they go through the cornfield. And I don't know, you've been in a cornfield at 110 degrees when you've got pivot irrigation going, and mosquitoes the size of blackbirds. It's a lot easier to do that when you're putting the nozzles on. Then with the new drop nozzles they have out today, the hoses don't get hard and brittle like they did if you had the black ones. So it's a lot easier to do when you don't have a crop in the field. We also put fertilizer through our pivots and fungicide, as long as you're not squirting the river, which I would never do. You make sure that it works well. On sugar beets, we put on 50 units. And if you have a lot of rain in the spring for an odd year or something, or you didn't have to irrigate up, you can adjust your fertilizer more or less, because with our company, we have to have it on by the 1st of July. So I get that done. But we vary it quite a bit. On years we get a lot of rain, we put on more. On years where we get a normal amount of rain, we didn't have to irrigate up. It only had to irrigate 2-3 times with the pivots in June. I put on less fertilizer and I get the same yield with better sugar. So it takes a little bit learning each one of your fields, but it works well. Do we run petioles on our beets? Well, oh yeah, potatoes, we did it weekly. I did it myself, and then we had a crop advisor that came out once a week and pulled samples. And yeah, we put on our potatoes, we could fertilize clear up to like a week before we were digging. We put fungicide on once a week, sometimes twice a week with the potatoes. So yeah, it really saves a lot of labor, and a lot of, airplanes aren't cheap. So, and on beets, they're finding out that it works better to go through the pivot than it does with a plane that likes to fly at 60 feet and use 0.3 gallons of water. Of course, the pivot, you're getting a lot more than 3 gallons of water. You're getting some fungicide on the ground, but that whole beet leaf's getting covered. And some fungicide on the ground is not a bad thing, because that fungus is in the ground. So it works well. It takes some time, and you got to get the right kind of pumps, and got to have a stirring system at your tank to keep your tank and chemical mix. Some of these chemicals are heavy, and if you stop stirring them, that stuff will settle in the bottom, and then you got a almost concrete mess. But if you got a good stirring system in them, and you can buy the ones the companies sell. I do have one of those. It works great, beauty. You can dial that thing to the nearest 1/10 of a gallon an acre if you want to, and you can set them up so if your pivot speeds up, it'll speed up. I never did that. I always set it at 3/4 of it or 1/2 inch or less to get it on the least amount of water I could, and get the chemical on it as fast as I could so I could get back to irrigating as normal. But you can, if you feel comfortable doing it that way, you can do it that way. There's some chemicals and fertilizers you can't put through the pivot, like phosphorus and potash and things like that. You won't have a pivot. That will just eat it up in a hurry, unless you get the polyline pipe and all that stuff, because you got other water troubles. But it's cheaper to hire or do that yourself. So
Got an answer for you.
Oh.
So Agri Industries found what spinners Nelson, or what nozzles Nelson was running,
Yep.
and it's rotators and spinners.
okay, rotators, spinners were the ones we use on wells. Rotators were the ones we use on flood irrigation. And I've had a whole bunch of different ones in between there. We put 10 different ones on one span, trying to figure out which one was the best. And the rotators, and they plug up less. And the new ones with the flip, clean the nozzle, work well unless you got a bunch of grass hanging there, which on the end of your pivot you'll end up with, but still easier to clean out. That's why I also like the phone control on the pivot, because I don't like getting wet that much. I shut the pivot off, clean the nozzles, turn the pivot back on without having to drive to the center. And you can get that on any pivot. And when you're working on the pivot, or putting an ag track on or putting a tire on, you got to move that pivot 6 inches. You got to drive 3 miles all around that pivot into that rough road into the pivot center, and then all the way back, or you have to have 2 people and a radio and a cell phone, or you have a phone control. You do it yourself, and I know it costs money, but it doesn't take much for your time to pay for that, and it works so much better than starting a pivot up with your landlord on the end, changing the end gun, and he didn't tell you. And you turn the pivot on and he's wiring it. That's 480 volts. I had a landlord just about kill me but he didn't pull the key. He left the key in the pivot. I went to start it. The end was over the hill. I started that pivot. He come flying off top of that thing. I didn't hurt him. Well, didn't kill him anyway. It burned his fingers a little bit, but I learned the hard way that you got to be really careful with it. 480 is not something to mess with. So there's good things that, and if you do that, please pull the key on your pivot panel. If you're going to work on it, nobody else is around, because that's not a fun thing to find. So now where was I? What color plates are we using with the rotators? Ours are gray. We started out with red ones or blue ones, and then we went to the gray ones. And I really didn't notice a lot of difference, but yeah, you can get a little bit of, not anymore. We don't have any more trouble with plug nozzles in corn than we do in beets or alfalfa. Just that you can't see them. If you got a whole pivot of corn, how do you know a nozzle's plugged? Unless you're flying a drone over the field, you'll see some corn starting to wilt, or you fly over it, or neighbor, or whatever. If we have a half pivot, then it's easy. But we do end up with full pivots of corn occasionally, And yeah, that's a huge problem. You know, you watch it when we do have roads going to the center of our pivots where you just dig up the crop. When beets, I don't do anything, but corn, I mow it off so I can drive in there without taking my mirrors off. I try to watch when it goes through there, but you can't see the whole thing, you know, so and I'm not of the belief that I need to walk that whole pivot every time it runs around, so. Nozzle what? Most of ours are like 48 inches. Mostly because when we go over where laterals used to be and through drain ditches and stuff, and we don't want them dragging on the ground. And we have some neighbors' fences that are overhangs, swing over. And you gotta watch for that, or your own fences and cricks and things like that. So, you know, we've got some that were just 2 or 3 feet off the ground, but we caught them dragging so much that they're all about this height. Some of them, yeah. So on the ends where they go over fences, some places we got them, so I almost have to have a 4-wheeler to stand on to get to that nozzle, but that makes it so it doesn't get cleaned as often too. So trees, do you know how fast trees can grow? Do you think you cut it off and, oh, that's good, it's not going to be back for 10 more years, and 2 weeks later it's snagging the end of your swing arm and it's tipping it over? Okay, it's the branch you forgot on the tree across the creek, but those things, cut them off, you got to expect them every year, because cottonwood tree, I don't know how many feet they can grow in a year, but they can grow a long way, especially when you're putting sprinkler water on them, and they're doing great. We've had enough trouble with that. We just lost a swing arm 2 years ago because I ran the pivot the opposite direction one time that year, and it hooked into a tree coming in and took the swing arm right off of it. So it's been talking about that. Insurance on your pivots. We've had different kinds of insurances, and then we went through our local dealer and got their insurance. Not their insurance, but the insurance that they are the adjusters for. Pretty much answers a whole lot of questions, because when your insurance dealer is your insurance adjuster, you don't have to argue over every little thing that goes on. We tipped one over this last year because the 3 safeties went out on a swing arm at the same time. We just put a new gearbox on it and started it up. I was driving out of the field, it was running, and all of a sudden, boom, it crashed. And it wasn't covered by insurance from an insurance dealer. It was my dad's pivot. It was covered by his insurance dealer. It took us 2 weeks longer to finally come up to a price. And we didn't wait. We put the new swing arm on since we'd already lost 2 pivots that year from storms. We didn't want to be losing any more yields. We put it up and just decided to deal with the insurance. But it was a lot easier to deal with the insurance that the adjuster is somebody that knows about pivots better than some guy that knows how to adjust a car dent or a windshield. There's a whole lot more dealing with it. So if you have a dealer that handles insurance and the price is reasonable, that's where I would go for the insurance, because it just makes life so much easier. And you will crash a pivot. I should have brought, I got pictures where I parked a disc gripper in the field, and I know I turned that pivot off. I got there the next morning, the tire hit 2 places on the disc gripper, didn't hit anything to wreck the disc gripper, didn't hurt the pivot because it safetied out. But if it had been 2 inches to the one side, it'll crawled over the top of that disc gripper, and it would have wrecked my swing arm. We had a guy combine, a custom combiner in our field, combine, and we were moving the pivot out of the way to finish combining. He gets out of his combine and runs and yelling at us that the pivot's going to hit him. Really, you're in a combine with the motor in your combine, and the pivot's going to hit you. He left the combine sit there, and the pivot hit it. So you got to tell your custom combiners things like, you know, you can drive where you already combined, you can drive over there. Or where you haven't combined if you're going to wreck a pivot. So you wouldn't think those kind of things would happen, but it happens. And your brother will leave it on, and it'll hit the combine header that you put out in the field when you're working on something else and didn't think about it. So just the stupidest little things. Round bales, fertilizer trucks, they'll park them and not tell you they parked it there the night before. You come there the next day and it's wedged up between the cab and the box on the fertilizer truck. So if it can happen, it'll happen. I was holding the override on a pivot because I couldn't figure out why it wouldn't move. Turns out it was hooked on a tree across the river by the end hose on it, and I flipped the last tower over. That was our second pivot. And, you know, so I learned if it's safetied out now, I go find out why. So, you know, be a little smarter than I was. not in big a hurry. I'm always in a hurry. Usually fixing things that Ryan has broken. If you don't know Ryan, he's sitting back here. He's my nephew. So he's gonna, some more disease stuff on like barley. You know, if you guys, I don't know if you guys have a lot of fusarium and stuff like that, if you follow corn with barley, but you have to be careful when you're watering it. And, you know, I don't know what's the, they don't have barley on here. They have winter wheat at 17 inches of moisture. And that's 17 inches of moisture is your soil moisture that's there already, plus what you have to add to get a crop at the end of the year. At home, our on average years for barley or wheat, it's like 9 or 10 inches of moisture we have to put on to extra to get a crop. But you can't just put that on. You have to put it on, you know, not when it's flowering, not when the wind's blowing 100 miles an hour, things like that. But so you have to, and after a few years, you just learn out when you can do it, when you can't do it. You know when your wheat or barley's flowering, so you don't water those days. But you make sure that it's got enough water in it afterwards. You'll do way less damage to the barley if it's turning and putting water on it than leaving it dry. Because it doesn't need a lot of moisture, but it needs enough to fill, and give it an extra inch when it's starting to turn. At least never hurt us. We had enough dry weather that it didn't bother any. That usually for us was the end of June when it's warm anyway. So all that stuff is going to be different for everybody because your soils are different and your farming methods are a little bit different. Like no-till sugar beets, you know, very seldom do we have to irrigate those up. But you know, occasionally you do, but it still just works that much better. So just how long is barley in bloom? I knew there was going to be somebody here to ask these questions that I don't pay attention to. I do because I look out in the field. It's not. I can water now. Week and a half, 2 weeks, you know, because it doesn't all come up at the same time. So, you know, you can't wait for 100% of it. Either way, you have to, you know, estimate, but that's what I usually wait a week, or maybe a little bit more, and then I go. But I try to make sure that it's got good moisture going into that, because if your guys' weather's like ours, right when it starts to pollinate, it's one of the hottest times of the year. So, you know, the thing is with pivots is to stay up on your water. Don't wait until July 4th to turn your pivot on. But at least for us, that's when we usually start irrigating sugar beets, is around the 1st of July. If we didn't have to irrigate up, well, we don't wait till the 1st of July to turn our pivots on. Even though the beets aren't dry, we don't let them get dry because you will not catch up. And our pivots are set up, most of them, that they'll put on about a third more water than most pivots will because of our pumps and nozzle sizes. So you still can't catch up. I mean, unless you get lucky and catch 1.5 inches or 2 inches of rain in July, that didn't come down in 15 minutes. So you get some, but you got to, the timing of that and the watching of the soil moisture is just hugely important underneath pivots. And pivot maintenance. Every spring we go through and clean every nozzle and regulator and check every gearbox, oil level, and the joints, whatever kind of joints you have on to hit your gearbox or whatever to your wheels, and the oils and all the drives. You know, for the first 5 or 6 years, it usually doesn't take much, but after that, you'll start getting little bitty leaks in your gearboxes. If we have to add much oil to a gearbox, we'll write the number of the tower down, the pivot down, and we'll spray the gearbox with yellow paint so that we know that gearbox. And then the next year we use a different color paint. We know that the gearbox is low on oil this year, and next year it's low on oil or lower on oil than it was. Then we usually pull it off and either put new seals on it or we just replace it. If the pivot's 20 years old, they start getting replaced because, again, August in the middle of a cornfield is not the place to be changing gearboxes, and they are not exactly light. Yep. Yeah, I was thinking about that. We do check the tire pressure every spring, and we keep our tires around 28 to 30 pounds. not as full as the full maximum tire pressure, because they squat a little bit more, the tracks are a little bit less, they get stuck a little bit less. And our pivots are not always stuck. We have some swing arm troubles because of our old drains, and the new pivots adjust the water better when the swing arms fold in, so you're not overwatering the swing arm area as much as you used to. So the water's not running down the tracks, and then when it goes on heavy ground and the water goes through the tracks, well, the tracks get deeper and pretty soon it's stuck. So we keep the oil level at that. We usually use the tall, narrow tires. They're smaller than 14.9s. They're pretty much standard now. Yep. Do taller tires work better than shorter tires? On our soils, they do. If you have light, sandy, gravelly soil, you can put the standard small tire on there. It'll work great. But if you have heavy soils and any low spots, some of them we actually use a little bit shorter tire, but wider tire. They're a 16.9 tire, and that works pretty good on swing arms where your swing arm is heavier than your normal pivot. So we used, on standard, when we put a pivot up, they automatically just give us the tall tires. And then if it's swing arm, they automatically put the wide tires on where the pivot ends and swing arm starts. That doesn't stop from getting stuck, but it is a lot less. And you guys have access to scorial, right? Scorial rock? No? No? It works great for filling pivot tracks. If your pivot track is, say, this deep and your pivot's stuck, and whatever you put in it, don't put non-crushed gravel in it, because all you're going to do then is the third time it goes back through there, it's going to have all that gravel squished back out again because it's round, and you'll be just as stuck, and now you'll have gravel in your field. If you didn't have a gravel spot, you do now. Lime rock from the sugar factory, the bigger stuff that they take out and can't you wouldn't dump in your corral for a fill, the hole, but it's bigger rock. It's inch and a half to across or so, and it's jagged. I use that if I don't have any scorial because it's free. Dump just a foot or two in the bottom of that track if you can. If the track is really deep and full of water, you got to put in more. But you fill that in and then close that track, and we've done that in several places. And now our tracks, instead of being 2 foot deep in that area, they're 6 inches because the water hits that gravel or that rock down there and drains out, or the rock keeps it from sinking and moving away. Scorial works just as well, because you can get bigger chunks of that. If you got a real bad spot, you dump that in there and cover it up and you're done. At least we've had it for 15 years and I still haven't had that pivot stuck in that spot again. So any kind of jagged rock you can get to put in those kind of holes is better. I've seen guys take their whole pivot track in the field and concrete it. Obviously they weren't sugar beet growers but when they started renting their ground out for sugar beets, the sugar beet grower the second year took it all out. So, that seems a little over the top to me too. But crushed concrete that they've taken off a highway or something that's bigger chunks, that would work too, if you could get a hold of it. It's hard to get a hold of anymore because everybody's using it. So anything you can put in there, we've dumped straw bales in there, railroad ties, but all that stuff comes back up. Straw's not going to hurt you, but that railroad tie coming back up next year, you hit the disc gripper, that can make a mess. So, what time is it? Actually burned up an hour. I didn't think I could talk that long. Yes. Use what? I can't hear you. Bubblers, no. Oh, really? Okay. Okay. Well, I do on some of them. That would be a good idea. I'm going to get your name and phone number afterwards, because we've never had that trouble. We always have it late August a little bit, but it's, it might plug an irrigation tube or something once in a while. But this year it was plugging lateral ditches, 36-inch culverts were plugging with this stuff. We finally they cleaned probably 80% of our laterals with the Traco this year with a water drain bucket to get the moss out, because we've never dealt with it before. They plugged our intakes at our canal 50 miles upstream. They were scraping them off all the time. Adding shears to the bubbers to help. Okay. I'm surprised environmentalists didn't get after us for killing killing the moss, but that's probably next year. So, I don't know if you guys heard, but we had a sturgeon problem on our irrigation project down there. We tried to build to improve our diversion dam from a wood and rock to concrete. You'd have thought we were gonna pave the whole state of Montana. But we got it done, so I'm happy now. With pivots too, when we first started putting pivots up in the state of Montana, we have a coal trust fund, and they would loan us money at 1.5% interest. At that time, interest was 5 or 6% over a period of years to put the pivot up, because they wanted us to put pivots up to save water, which we thought was a great deal. We get cheap money, and we want to save water too. I don't, we're always short water in irrigation projects. We're always rationing water. We put up 6 or 7 pivots, and a few years ago they started rationing water, and the ditch rider called us up and said, "You guys can have 7 more heads." We had all the water we could handle and wanted. So just by doing that on a 3,500 acre farm, when water rationing came up, we were never short of water again, because we had over half our farm on pivots. Now that close to half our irrigation project is under pivots. I mean, this spring we had a little trouble because of no rain. Everybody was trying to irrigate up the same week, but still didn't have a water shortage problem like we've had on just about every year in the 80s and 90s and the 70s and the 60s. And I remember my grandpa fighting with the ditch rider on top of the ditch bank, and he was German, so I couldn't understand a word he was yelling at the ditch rider, and I don't think ditch rider could understand either, but I knew what he was saying. So, I'm sure you guys have the same trouble with everybody wanting to irrigate at the same time, that there's just shortages of water at times, until everybody gets spread out and things work better. But so pivots have really made a big difference on. Now they're worried about us not putting enough water on, because people's wells are going dry. The drain ditches are running, and the ducks and the turtles and the fish don't have a place to go. I'm going, just 20 years ago, you were mad at me because there was water running down these ditches and we were wasting all this river water. Now you're mad at me because I'm not wasting enough water to put, when you flood irrigate, most of that water goes back into the river anyway, either through the top water or through the groundwater. It runs downhill. The river's downhill. But now with pivots, you're not doing that, and now they have another reason. So you can't ever keep these people happy. Whatever you do, 10 years from now, it'll be the wrong thing, even though they were happy with us when we first started. So, and my yard water well went dry this summer because there was no water. So, but I now have brown grass, which I'm liking because I don't have to mow it. So, is there any more questions on pivots? Yes. Lodging? Really careful on the amount of fertilizer we apply. Really careful on how much water we apply at one time. On barley and wheat, especially when it starts, it's flowered and start to get some weight in the heads. I don't put on 1 1/4 inches. It'll be a 1/2 inch or 65/100, and just like on a half pivot, I just hit it more often. But you're going to get some lodging on some years, because sure as heck, the day after you put that second 65/100 on and you think, I'm done for the year, you get 1.5 inches of rain and your barley field's laying down. That's Mother Nature. But usually on those type of situations, we find we don't have a lot of trouble with that barley at lodge from that last rainstorm. It's if you put on 2 inches of moisture, or you put manure on your field and then you put another 100 units of nitrogen on your field because you weren't thinking, and then your barley lodges, the minute it starts to be in the boot, like some guys, the day after it comes out, some guys got barley laying down because they grew up in Illinois where it rained 3 inches a week. So they put on 3 inches of water a week, matter if it needs it or not, on their barley. And then they get mad because Budweiser didn't take their barley. After a year of that, you learn not to do it. But if you're really careful when you water it, when it's heavy, you don't have a lot of trouble. We very seldom had trouble with it. Once or twice when we got the heavy 3-4 inch rains in a couple hours after, in early July or late June. And then some people would use some of the growth stunting chemicals and stuff under barley to stop it from doing that, and that seemed to help. But the timing on that, I could never seem to get down. Yep.
What about the
Dammer
dammer diapers?
dikers. Well, we don't use one because most of our ground, or all of our ground, was flood irrigated, so it's pretty level, other than a short little chunk where the ditches were. We have a lot of guys out there that were took dry land farm ground and made it into irrigated, and they do use them, and they do work. You know, you have to, when you get used to your pivot and start using the variable application systems and stuff that are on it. So when you're going up a hill, you're putting on a ½ inch instead of the inch and things like that. You need them less, but they still work, and they still save your water, and they save the soil and save all that. So yeah, they're worth using. Yep. Oh. We talked about them some, and we do. Last year we borrowed one. We're buying one now. Track eliminator that goes on the back of your tractor, and it's not the same as the ditch closer. It doesn't kill, like we went through our hay fields with it last year, and the track eliminator filled the track in, and it's got a packer wheel on back, and then we took the tractor and drove it around to pack it down even more, because I had 2.5 foot tracks in there. It's been in hay 5 years. We've never done anything with the tracks. And then went over it again, and we only killed like 2 inches of alfalfa on either side of that track. And after second cut, you couldn't even see we did it. If you take a ditch closer out there, well, ditch closer is a whole lot wider than 2 inches wider than that pivot track. So it's not going to close it as good. It will close it, if you're going to work the field or something. But that machine they make, especially for closing pivot tracks, works really well. I tried hanging one on the last tower of a pivot. Second or third pivot we put up, this will work good. I can just put this down and it'll go. Until I realized when I turned the pivot the other direction, I had to go out there and pick all them up. I only put one on to try it. Now it's still on that pivot, but it's been hanging there so long, the bearings are all rusted because somebody moves it backwards without it being on there. Not only does it wreck the track eliminator, it wrecks the pivot tire and all that stuff. So I decided that wasn't worth using. But the one in the tractor works really well. And we, how often do I use the track eliminator? Well, I don't. Since I have one, we've had 2 years ago, too much rain in 19, digging beets was in mud. In 20, our summer was dry, and our pivot tracks were terrible. I mean, at the end of the field where the swing arm went, where you end up with 4 tracks right side by side, you could hardly sit in the beet digger. It was, I mean, usually the track's got some moisture in them, so the dirt kind of caves in and you go. Nah, not in 20. It was like somebody poured a 2-foot concrete wall. I mean, even digging at a ½ mile an hour, almost throw you out of. If I have another year like that, those outside tracks will get closed. I mean, I'll lose a few beats, but I'll save a lot of teeth and truck tires and truck radiators and all that stuff. So there is people to do that. And if your tracks are really bad, I would do that. We just did that hayfield first time in 5 years. So it depends, and that's lighter soil, so the tracks aren't as bad. But if you got a cornfield or something and you've chopped it and you got big tracks and you're gonna just no-till wheat or barley into it the next year, then we use the track eliminator. If we're gonna work the field, we don't. But what's that? Yeah. With no-till and sugar beets, I haven't been closing the tracks, so I didn't have anything to close them with. But now I do. And in 2020, since we had so much rain in 19, most of our sugar beets go on soybean residue. We combine our soybeans during beet harvest. So needless to say, I do all my fall work on my sugar beets mostly after beet harvest. Well, it rained. I couldn't do it. So we no-tilled about 2/3 of our beets in, and I didn't close the pivot tracks. That's part of the reason why at the end of digging in 2020 was miserable. And truck drivers told me if I ever do this again, I won't be back. My radiator guy liked it. So. We plant straight. do you raise sugar beets? But do you raise sugar beets? Okay, I mean, I plant them. I used to cultivate them, spray them. Now I plant them, and then I'm done. I drive a truck. But there's no way in the world you're going to get me to plant sugar beets in a circle. I can't get truck drivers to drive straight. How can I get them to drive at a 2% angle on the steering wheel all the way around that field? Plus the driver drive that tractor. I mean, it'll go straight down the rows. It's not going to make that corner. I won't do it. My brother came up with that idea, and I said, right, you're going to take this 1.25 mile long run I got, and you're going to make it 3 miles all the way down to 100 feet. I hate short rows. I don't mind the 3 mile long runs, but then the fields are square, so your rows end. Then you got to turn around and drive back the other way empty or whatever. So we combine in circles because you don't have to cross pivot tracks, and we chop our corn straight, and we dig our sugar beets straight and plant them. I plant the corn and I plant the sugar beets. If they're going to start planting them in circles, they're going to find some other brother because I'm not doing it. GPS works way, and you can GPS a circle too, but I don't know, I use a monosim drill because of our sugar beets. It's not designed to have sideways pressure on it all the time going around the field. So, no, thank you. But I've seen people said they're going to try it. I never went and watched them do it because I don't want the headache, and I don't want somebody in my farm thinking that's a good idea. Digs in circles. And maybe it's not as hard as I think, but I'm too set in my ways. I got GPS for straight rows. I like that. So I imagine if you had really bad pivot tracks, that might be something to think about. But I just, now I'm going to have to go to Orland and look. I do know some of those guys. So I've never seen that in a sugar beet magazine or anything. No, so now I'm going to have to look. I didn't think a self-propelled digger would work either. So they don't in heavy ground, but they do work in light ground.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
But like last year, it was so dry, I turned the pivots on as soon as I got water in the ditch. And we were always having so much trouble getting our hay to dry that now, about a week before we cut our hay, I turn the water off. And then we can get the bales up, and we get the bales off the field as fast as we can, and the water goes back on. Then I do the same thing. I try to shut it off 5 days to 7 days before we cut it, so the top of the ground dries off. And it hasn't seemed to hurt our yield. Only way I learned that irrigating alfalfa, that I wasn't irrigating enough, in 2015 is the year we got 15 inches of rain in spring, after we had 3 feet of snow in spring, so our fields flooded twice. And the hay field, half the pivot got flooded and half the pivot didn't. The half that got flooded had like a third more production than the half that didn't. I went, well, must be water. And it was. So I learned to put more water on. I always used my Soil Pro everything. I always had good moisture clear down to 12, 16 inches, but it wanted more. So now I turn it on and leave it on and shut it. I mean, if we get 2, 3 inches of rain, I'll shut it off for a couple of days. But if it's raining at night or just raining, I leave my pivot on because the only time of the year you get 100% efficiency on your water is when it's raining. So if you're trying to catch up or trying to do any of that, if you only get a ½ inch of rain, do not shut your pivot off. What you guys will know that anyway. You only get 6 inches of rain. You get ½ inch at a time anytime?
Once in a while.
Once in a while.
In a long while.
Yeah. That's when you have a lot of runoff, that's when I start using the I remember what they call it. You can set your pivots up on like a pie system. You can put up this much water in this area. It doesn't work perfect with your soil contours, but it helps. I put less water in those areas that the water can run on. And if I start getting a lot of that, I just shut the pivot off. And I make sure I got good soil moisture on there. I try not to let that happen. Sometimes you can't help it. I mean, if you got a small area in your field that there's a 2-foot drop, but it's only 15 feet, you're going to have water running. I don't care what it does. Or if you're flood irrigating a field right next to it and it runs to the old drain used to be in your pivot field, you're going to have trouble. But you can learn. There's management tools. I mean, ways of running your pivot and ways to do all that on super dry years, it's hard to do that because you're constantly irrigating. At least for us, it's harder to do that. But for normally you can, dammer dikers, if you got a lot of that trouble, work well. If you got long slopey fields or rolling hills or something like that, work really well to stop that. If you're not raising, if you can plant against that slope, that works better. I used to do that when we rented some ground up north of Williston that was rolling hills. I tried to plant the beets crossways to the, to some of the slope. Don't try to dig beets at a 45-degree angle. That don't work either. But, or at an angle to it so the water doesn't have a straight run down the hill. But that you have to learn if you can do or not. I try.
Other questions? Okay, let's take about a 5-10 minute break to give Don a little rest, and then we'll jump back into soil moisture monitor. So feel free to stretch your legs. We'll jump back into it. I'm gonna go check on lunch because that's what you came for. So we'll see you guys in a bit. that you thought of while we had this break? Okay, will do. We'll turn the volume up on the speaker. Anybody have any last minute questions before we switch topics? You nailed it. They don't have any questions. You're good.
I'm just that good.
You're just that good. Yes. Okay, we're going to switch topics now and switch over to soil moisture sensors and just get Don's experience, what he's using, why he's using it. So again, we're here for you. So grill him with all the questions you can, because we want it to help you as much as possible. So again, we'll turn it over to you, Don. Let me get you the microphone and we'll do a sound check to make sure you guys in the back can hear real clear.
There we go. Hello? Okay. Oh, tangled up. Okay. I did have one thing to go back on the pivots is the tire sizes. Somebody asked me that. And our normal tall tires are 11.2/38. And the fat tires we put on the end of the pivot before the swing arm and on the swing arm are 14.9/42 or 24s. And then rarely in our area, but there's 11.2/24s that are on some real sandy soil and things that don't have track problems. But 99% of ours are 11.2/38. And now they make one that's bi-directional that is even better than the old tractor tire tread. It works just as well both ways. You don't have to worry about if the guy put the tire on forward or backwards. Oh, airless. I thought you said Harris. We got several guys that tried them. Their pivot tracks are worse. One guy's got like 120 of them to sell. Well, these ones the ones I seen were green and had holes in them. And the only one I still see on them is there's a guy that's got one on the end of his pivot, and that's been on it for 4 or 5 years, and he hasn't put any more of them on. Everybody I've talked to that's tried them, they're just too stiff. Now, in certain areas, I bet they work really well on lighter soils and things, but on heavy soil, that's why we let the air out of our tires is to make a little fatter track and a little less digging power. That's why the ones with the straight lugs on them, they're bidirectional. I was a little worried about those because of that. Have you seen any of the ones where steel rims with the flat track things on them? Oh, yeah, those were good at digging trenches for pipelines. Yeah, they start spinning and they flip that thing up, and then you turn the pivot on the other way and you got a dredger. And they took those off within like two rotations of the pivot. They were gone. So they were a good idea. It just didn't work in our area. Arizona, I think they work well. Sandy, some of their sandier soils. Okay, and I will be here for lunch because I like food. And if anybody has any more questions, they can find me. Now for their short subject, soil moisture monitors. I've used several different kinds. The ones we have now are the Centric Probes. They're the ones that the Belmont guys sell that go to our work with our Valley pivot controls on our phone. It comes across because they own it. Comes across our phones. There's a subscription to them and a cell phone hooked onto them, so you can put them any place out in the field. You don't have to walk out there and check it. You can get on your phone, find how much water you're putting on, how much moisture is in the soil. You can look at your water trends, your water use trends. You can track how much water you put on for the year and things like that. So, and there's more things you can do with it if you are interested in having your moisture probe run your pivot, which scares me a little bit. First off, you have to have them all over the field. And I don't want to spend that kind of money, but they work good to put them in different places in the field, especially if you're trying to prove to somebody that you're not overwatering or that they're underwatering. And to me, underwatering is worse than overwatering, unless you're flooding out huge acres. But a crop can deal with a little bit too much water than it can deal with not enough water real easy. So it makes it easier for you, faster for you. If you put them in, we don't have one in every field. I move them to the sugar beet fields. And I've usually put one, on one certain field that I have them in. I always put it on sort of the lighter soil area of the field. So I know that if I can get moisture down there 28 inches, I've got my soil full, so I'm good. Last year I couldn't. It just, whatever I did, I could not get that full. But you're watering too much. Come here, I'll show you this. And it stops them from complaining. If you're paying for water by the foot, this is really a good idea. And there's crop metrics and Watermark. Watermark is the other one I've used, which if you learned how to read them on your soil, you could read yours. You couldn't read your neighbors because of how they're set up. They worked okay. They took 2 weeks after you put them in the ground before they would start giving you a reading you could use, but at least you had something there that you didn't have to go out in the middle of your field and check where that moisture. And that's part of the trouble with pivots. It's not a 40-acre field anymore. It's 160 or 350 or whatever. That's a long walk. If unless you put it right alongside the road, which everybody knows isn't going to tell you anything. You need to have it out in the middle of your field where your swing arm isn't folding up and some of the stuff's not getting mowed off or sprayed or whatever, and the road dust isn't blowing on. You get a better reading. If you know the areas of your field that you have trouble with, you put the moisture monitor in that area, and if you're overwatering too much, you put it in the heavier parts of your soil, and then you just makes management way easier, and you can look at it 15 times a day wherever you're at. So they work really well. But I only have just a couple years experience with the new ones that Valley has out. I like them. They're, you have to be careful when you're installing them. And there's a subscription with them every year because there's a cell phone out there. It doesn't cost, for the crop acres in the field, it doesn't cost much. I think for all of ours, it's like $500 a year. So you can go with the Watermark ones that you buy yourself and install and do all that. You just have to treat them right, and you have to walk out in the field and check them. Now, they might have new ones now that do the same thing, but you're going to have a subscription on anything that's got a cell phone in it. You're going to get to pay for. So it doesn't take much because it's data. It's just a little bit of data. So, but it makes it easy to track your water use throughout the year, or you can see how much you put on last week, or you tell how much it rained because there's a rain gauge on them. So, unless you're raining and irrigating at the same time, that's hard to tell which one's which, but you still know how much water you put on that night. So they work well. They make them, like I said, so you can, and I don't know anybody that does this, you can hook them to your pivot, so it'll automatically turn on the sprinkler. But I like to be there when I turn on the sprinkler, just to make sure it doesn't not work. Or it'll tell you if there's water on, or if it's got water pressure, but how many nozzles are plugged and all that stuff. So, it's nice to be able to take your phone out and check to make sure your pivots are all running, and you don't have to drive 35 miles down the road just to make sure that after that lightning storm, your pivot didn't get hit, because it'll tell you if it's running or not. Or you can turn them on and point them in the right direction, so hopefully the wind doesn't get them. This year that didn't work. Doesn't matter which direction you had them pointed. The way the storm came through our area, it took 58 pivots, and that wind changed directions 15 different times. It was tornadoes, basically what it was. It just kept changing directions, no matter which way your pivot was going. Unless it was full of water, it was over. Swing arms anyway. And then that was when this COVID stuff was going on. It took one company, a guy had his pivot sitting there for 2.5 months to get his parts. Then his parts got there and waited another 3 weeks for a crew to come around and put it up. He ended up going to a competitor company and had a different swing arm put on his pivot. And that is not a company, that's more of a management deal. But if you got good companies, they're going to have parts on hand. And good thing that the storm didn't happen in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado all at the same time, because they were stealing parts from Nebraska and Western Montana to bring to Sydney to put pivots up. So if that happens in 3 times, 3 different states, that's not going to work so well. But they got them up fast. But the soil moisture probes, like I said, they cost a little bit, but they give you peace of mind. They also help you, maybe you don't have to use them forever. That's why I just buy a few and move them around, because you've been around your fields long enough. You know how this works and how that works. But if you are having a water rationing thing or anything, you have the right there proof of what you've done and how much water you put on, and it's all measured. So I don't, they make, you guys put measuring devices on your pivots when you put them up or not? They're starting to require that with an irrigation project now. So, which I don't know why. We don't pay for water by the acre foot or anything. We pay by the acre so much for irrigation project, and that's it. So, but I imagine in the future someday somebody will be piping water out of the Yellowstone River to Arizona or something, so somebody can live in the desert, and we'll have to prove how much water we're using. Is there any questions on moisture monitors? I don't have a lot of knowledge on them. I think it's 6 inches. It starts at 6 inches and goes every 6 inches down to 28 or 30 inches. And ours, our local dealer puts them in. They're kind of finicky to put in. That was part of the deal he made with us when we bought them, and they take them out and they store them. So some of these moisture monitors you have to store under certain humidity conditions and all that stuff, so that otherwise you end up replacing probes. So you store them right, keep them dry or whatever, and they're fine, or don't let them freeze, you're fine. So for us, that works well. Some people put them in themselves. I just got too much going on. And then, of course, if they put them in, I can put them in the middle of the field someplace because I don't have to walk out there. They do. But it's in the spring, so they take 4 wheelers to drive out there. So I don't know, have any of you guys tried soil moisture monitors at all? Because it's so dry here. I mean, I hate to keep bringing that up, but I did not realize you guys were 6 inches of moisture a year. I hate 12. I would. I was wondering why all the sagebrush on the hillsides, it looks like Miles City, Montana. And where does your water come from? Does it come out of the river or out of the dam? Well, but you guys have moss trouble in June. So you're just that much warmer. And I suppose the water's clear. You don't have Yellowstone muddy water. Well, I guess there is some advantages to adding an inch to your soil every year from the water that you irrigate with. If they get a rain in Billings in 2 days, our water looks like chocolate milk. You know, they call it the Yellowstone for a reason. It's yellow. But yep. I use 1 in each field. I know some guys that put 4 in, but again, I know my fields, so I put them in the area that I'm having trouble with, or I think I'm going to have trouble with, and it worked out well. And after 4 years of having them in, or 3 years, I kind of know even in that area what's going on, but I own them. So I like them there just because I can be sitting at home Sunday night at 8 o'clock, go, oh, should I start that pivot tomorrow or not? I got to order water. I can look and say, I don't need it, or yeah, I should have done it 3 days ago. But I check them every day, so I know what's going on out there. So you kind of know how fast. And when you know that type of soil is there where that probe is, and you're irrigating that in sugar beets or corn, and you got a field 3 miles away that's basically the same kind of soil, the same kind of crop, and you irrigated it the same, you know that it's dry or wet too. So in the same field. How old a pivot? How old a pivot? Oh, so it's not nozzles. And that's when I started using the variable rate application thing. I go to in the sandy areas when I use that deal, it puts it like 1.15 on the sandy areas and 65, 70 hundredths on the heavy areas. So I'm not overwatering the heavy areas, but I'm getting the sandier areas wet enough. And that seems to help a lot on our yields. So it's not a miracle cure, but it's a lot better than flood irrigation, because on flood irrigation in those fields, some of those fields we used to irrigate 11 times a year. I mean, you get done irrigating, you turn around and start irrigating again. Everybody really liked it when it was their turn to irrigate that field, because you knew what you were doing every Sunday. You know, so with the pivot, at least you have a better chance of keeping that wet, as long as you don't get behind on it. So it does help with that.
Are you still going out with the rope then as well?
Oh, yes. Yep. I use that all the time, but I use that in flood irrigated fields. You know, I'm on our farm, I'm the sugar beet guy and the corn guy as far as getting the crop in and raising it. I water everything that's under pivot. I've had too many back surgeries to be moving tubes anymore. So that's what I do. So I got either that on my side-by-side or in the back of my pickup, and I walk in 120 rows or whatever in spots when I'm checking for diseases, and I use that as a walking stick, and I probe it whenever I'm out there. So, and they're not very expensive. When I bought that one, it was $11, but that's 30 years ago. And you can see it's now close to wore out, so. And like I said, it makes it simple to check and a lot lighter than a shovel. It helps also to know what your soil moisture is when you're dealing with diseases. And the soil probe helps you with that too, because you know, if you think you're going to water because you don't think you have enough moisture out there to finish your malt barley, which we used to have more trouble with diseases on malt barley than anything else. If you got good moisture at 6 inches down, it's filling, you're done. If it's dry, you got to put it on, then you got to take the chance of Fusarium coming in or whatever when you do that, so you can spray it and then water it, or whatever you want to do, or just take your chance and not water it. But it just helps you it's just another tool. It you know, I guess how much trust you have in technology is, you know, how you know, this one here doesn't make a mess. It doesn't tell you wrong answers unless it's 105 degrees outside. You don't want to walk to the middle of that field. That's me. But the soil probe and the pivot, I mean, if you're already using, especially the newer style pivots with I mean, I started with pivots that had dials, you know, click, 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 1 inch, you know, 17 rotations, get back to 1/4 inch, and an on switch and an off switch. And you got lucky if the stop worked, because then it would shut off when it went around. And if it's 78 miles from your house, you didn't know if it was running or not. And 90% of the times when that pivot's 40 years old, that automatic shut off at the end wasn't working anymore. Of course, when you didn't think it was going to work and drove way up there, it worked. When you didn't drive up there, you go up the next day and it was still running. So, but the newer stuff, which is harder to deal with, but it does so many nice things like the variable rates, the new swing arms or the whole pivots if you want, but swing arms that you can turn off each individual nozzle as it folds up and folds out. Because if you're going up a hill, when it folds up, you're most likely overwatering. But if you have this system on your pivot, you can shut off nozzles, not all at one time, but rotate them so that everything's getting water, but nothing's getting overwatered. We have one pivot like that we had a lot of trouble with swing arm getting stuck, and we put that on there, and it works really well. But they don't come free. None of that stuff comes free. That's the problem with it all. It costs money, and it's hard enough today to make money farming anyway. You have to be really careful what you're spending money on. So, but pivots, if you can't get help and you're 60 years old and don't want to irrigate 500 acres of beets by yourself, you don't have a lot of choice. So, any other questions on anything? Oh, the swing arms? Yep. The first ones we put on, well, we've got one now for 25 years, and it was one of the first precision arms that Barley came out with. It's computer ran, and I mean, other than lightning strikes and things like that, we haven't had any trouble with them. You learn how to, you got to override safety sometimes when they get stuck and things like that, but they're no different. We've got one for 25 years, and it's standing up really well. You hit a tree, that doesn't, but none of them stand up that. And we have the new ones that are just the manual slide operated ones that are GPS guided as far as keeping in the field. I like those because you can change where that, if you put a buried wire in, like our first ones are guided by buried wires, if you run a tractor that's 550 horsepower and you're disc ripping, you think, finally, I'm gonna rip this field 21 inches deep. Oh, you hit your wire every time you crossed it. So you get put a new wire in. GPS, you don't have to do that. You can't hit GPS wires. So there's advantages to that. And the new ones are simpler. You know, you can still get to precision arms that I think do a little bit better job watering, but the new systems they have on the new arms do a pretty good job. And you can put all the fancy switches on those too if you want to. So, and they're a lot cheaper and less maintenance, and lightning strikes don't bother them near as much. That's the problem with having two computer boxes on the end of your pivot, at least for us, we get a lot of lightning storms. And doesn't a year go by, we don't lose a computer. Yet another reason to have your your pivot dealer as your insurance adjuster. Because the other guy will try to tell you it's a spike of power coming through the REA power lines that took it out. So, but we haven't had any trouble with them any more than pivots without swing arms. Did you have another one? They have, yeah, they use their soil maps that we have and tell you that when you start, which, yeah, makes a big, again, knowing your fields makes a difference, but the soil maps help you. I mean, it can help you tell where to put them, and also, yeah, help tell you your soil water holding capacity and all those things. That's where the soil probe, the manual one is, it's all in your judgment how much moisture is there, you know, and most soils, if it's below 60% moisture, you're not getting any moisture out of it. So, you know, after doing it for a year or 30, you kind of figure that out, but it takes time. And if you turn any of that stuff over to somebody young that hasn't done much of it, it's a learning curve. Are we done? Told you it was going to be short.
Other question?
Like I said, I will be here for lunch, so if anybody has anything.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Don. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much for taking your time coming down.